"Please don't take our food. We saved all day for this," said the little boy to the lonely rich rancher. It was late winter, 1889, on the desolate plains of the Wyoming territory, where the Morgan Ranch stood like a fortress against the elements. The weather was merciless. Snow drifted across the prairie in heavy gray sheets, burying the barbed wire fences and piling up knee-deep against the wind-battered posts. A bitter, howling wind ripped through the trees clinging to the ridge, carrying a chill that cut straight through wool and leather to the bone. Near the ranch's mess hall, a handful of shivering cowboys huddled close to a barrel fire, their arms outstretched to catch even a flicker of warmth, the flames dancing on their faces which were set like masks against the freezing air. Through this swirling white hell, Silas Morgan rode slowly, his horse's breath pluming in the frigid air like smoke. His heavy coat was stiff with frost, and the brim of his hat was pulled low over eyes that were as grey and unforgiving as the winter sky. He was 38 years old, but the relentless hardship of the seasons had etched deep lines into his face, making him appear much older. He dismounted near the stable, clutching the reins in one hand while slipping the other into his pocket to straighten his worn leather gloves. The cold gnawed at his boots as he stepped onto the packed snow, his presence commanding a quiet respect even in the storm. A flicker of movement near the back of the mess hall caught his sharp eye, something behind the barrels and crates where the kitchen scraps were discarded. He paused, squinting through the gale, and noticed 4 small children huddled against a sagging wood bin that had been cracked by age and the freeze. They moved silently, heads bowed low, scavenging through the snow as if hoping it might yield something warm to eat. The eldest of the group, a boy of no more than 5 years named Eli, stood protectively at the front. He was gaunt, his limbs thin under ragged clothes, his cheeks raw and red from windburn. Behind him crouched a girl, June, about 4, her fingers lost inside mittens that were far too thin to offer any real protection. A smaller boy, Tommy, about 3, clung tightly to her coat sleeve, while the smallest, a toddler named Annie, sat half-wrapped in a tattered swaddling cloth that did little to hold out the biting cold. Their small faces were pale, eyes wide and hollow, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, yet they kept hunting hungrily among the frozen scraps. Suddenly a ranch hand, heavy-lidded and rough-jawed, stomped toward them with a scowl. "Scatter, kids!" he growled, his voice harsh against the wind. "This ain't for stray pack rats." He raised a threatening hand as if to scare them off like pests. For a moment, the silence was cold and brittle, heavier than the snow. Then, Eli's voice cracked the air. "Please, do not take our food. We saved all day for this." His words hung stark and desperate in the wind. June's small bundle of stale bread crackled as she tried to lift it, but her numb fingers failed her, and she dropped a crust into the snow. She bent quickly, shaking to scoop it up, looking up at the man with terrifying desperation. "Mama says, eat slow so we will not be hungry later." Tommy's lips quivered as he whispered to Eli, "Can we bring some back for Mama?" Eli answered softly, "We will share. Mama eats first." He explained that their mother had skipped breakfast that morning. Baby Annie shivered violently, murmuring in a voice raw and thin, "Bread warm," her lips parting as if she could already taste the hope of sustenance. Silas stood motionless in the shadows, watching the scene unfold. His breath came slow and even, misting in the bitter air. His eyes did not soften, yet his hand closed around the reins with a quiet, steely firmness. He did not shout, nor did he make a grand gesture. He simply turned and walked into the mess hall without a word. The cook looked up, startled, spitting his rag onto the table and wiping his hands on his apron. "What is it, Mr. Morgan?" he asked, peering at the boss under the flickering lantern light. "One portion," Silas said. His voice was calm, low, carrying neither anger nor charity, just an absolute command. No name, no question. The cook hesitated only a split second before setting to work. He ladled steaming beans into a tin pan, wrapped a chunk of coarse cornbread in cloth, added 2 boiled potatoes, a hunk of salted ham, and tucked in a slice of apple, tying the parcel with twine. Silas accepted the warm bundle, his gloved hands crinkling the cloth as he folded it over with slow, careful precision. He stepped back out into the relentless snow, the wind still gusting. The children were still there, eyes wide, bodies coiled with fear and need. Silas approached slowly, his boots sinking deep into the white drifts. He stopped a few feet from them, crouched down, and set the parcel against the base of a hardy pine tree, whose boughs offered the only scant shelter from the gale. He did not look at any of them directly. He did not speak. Eli stepped forward, uncertain. His lips parted as if to say thanks, and the others shifted closer, hope suddenly lighting their frozen faces. Silas rose, turned his back on them, and walked away. He mounted his horse without looking back, his boots leaving heavy prints near the tree. As his hoofbeats faded into the white plains, all that remained was the wind and the tin parcel beneath the pine, a fragile promise of warmth and food in a world that had offered them neither. The wind had calmed by midnight, but the biting cold remained, settling over the ranch land like a heavy shroud. Snow fell in quiet, relentless sheets, blurring the sharp outline of the abandoned horse barn behind the main house. Inside a makeshift tent, stitched together from scavenged burlap and old feed sacks, Miriam sat curled beside a flickering fire made from bark scraps and stolen bits of straw. Her arms were wrapped tight around a rusted tin pot resting on her knees, inside of which 3 small potatoes sat half-cooked, their skins blistering in the weak heat. The fire barely warmed her fingers, let alone the freezing space around her, and her 4 children lay tangled beside her in a heap of fabric that was barely worthy of the word blanket. Their faces were smudged with ash and dust, but their bellies were full for the first time in days. The youngest, Annie, whimpered softly in her sleep, dreaming of the warmth they had just tasted. Eli, the oldest at 5, sat closest to the fire, his small hand hovering in hesitation near the pot. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling not from cold but from a sudden, terrifying thought. "We used to have a bigger pot, didn't we? And Papa used to bring wood. Lots of it." Miriam didn't lift her eyes from the dying embers. She stirred the potatoes with a splintered twig, her heart aching. "Yes, baby. Bigger than this." And yes, he did. The silence that followed was thick with grief. June stirred next, blinking up at her mother with sleepy, hopeful eyes. "Mama, if tomorrow's not cold, will you smile again?" Miriam forced a breath through her nose, reaching to adjust the ragged blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "Maybe," she murmured, "if tomorrow is kind." Since that night at the mess hall, something had shifted in the dark. The children no longer feared the man in the heavy coat who never spoke. They had given him a name, whispered between themselves like a secret spell. The Quiet Uncle. "Uncle Quiet is watching again," June would say, peeking from behind a frost-covered beam. "He walks like he is part of the wind," Eli added, his eyes wide with a strange admiration. Silas never approached them directly, maintaining the distance of a ghost haunting his own land. But each evening, like clockwork, something would appear by the barn door. A bundle of chopped wood, a loaf of bread wrapped in clean cloth, sometimes a single apple with the blemishes carefully carved off. He never left a note, never stayed to see it taken, and never acknowledged them in the daylight. But Eli noticed. Eli, at 5 years old, decided he had something to give back. With a broken piece of charcoal and scraps of brown wrapping paper scavenged from behind the cookhouse, he began to draw. The first was a lopsided horse, the second, a crooked house with a chimney blowing smoke like a storm cloud. Then came the sun, drawn too big for the page, with lines like sunbeams reaching into the corners. Each morning before the others woke, Eli would tiptoe barefoot across the ice to the corner post where Silas usually stood watching the land, pressing his artwork between 2 heavy stones. He never saw the man take them, but they disappeared by noon. One morning, Silas rode along the east fence line, checking the wire, the snow crunching loudly beneath his boots as he dismounted to fix a broken rail. That was when he saw it, a small sheet of paper fluttering in the wind, pinned under a stone. He reached for it with gloved hands. The drawing was simple, a stick figure with a big hat and a square jaw standing protectively between 4 smaller figures. A line of smoke curled from a house in the background, and scrawled across the bottom in crooked childish letters were the words, "You are a good man, Mama says." Silas did not move for a long time. His breath fogged in the winter air, and a crow cawed somewhere far off in the distance. He read the words again, and then again. Slowly, he folded the paper with careful fingers and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket where a long-forgotten letter still lived, a letter he had written a decade ago, but never mailed to a woman who had left before she ever arrived. He did not revisit that memory then. He only closed his coat tighter against the chill and kept riding. That night, the wind howled louder than it had in weeks, clawing against the windows of the ranch house like a restless ghost, moaning through the eaves and whistling down the stone chimney. Silas Morgan could not sleep. He sat in his dark study, one boot propped on the edge of the fireplace grate, watching the flames lean and twist. He held a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid trembling with every gust that rattled the shutters. Eventually he stood, the hallway creaking under his weight as he walked to the far end of the house where a narrow door led down to the cellar, a place he had not visited in years. He carried a lantern, the light swinging to reveal a room lined with wooden crates and dust-covered trunks. In the corner, half buried under old tarps and an unused saddle, was a cast-iron safe, its hinges stiff with disuse. Silas knelt, wiped the dial clean with his sleeve, and spun the combination from memory. Click. Inside, the contents were sparse: a leather pouch of silver coins, a deed, and a neatly folded white cloth, the corner embroidered with tiny deliberate stitches reading E and S. He lifted the cloth gently, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. Wrapped inside was a gold ring, plain, sturdy, made to last, and beneath it, a single page, yellowed slightly, but the handwriting still sharp, elegant, and cold. He read it again, though he knew every word by heart. You thought I loved you. I needed a way out of poverty. You were kind, but not enough. Not to stay. Esther, 7 years. He had not touched this safe since the week she left. She had vanished with the wagon, 2 of the best horses, and nearly every cent in their shared account. He had told no one, burying her name deeper than any grave, locking it in iron and silence. He had not loved another since, had not trusted, had not needed, until a boy's voice broke through snow and wind saying, "Please don't take our food." Silas placed the letter back into the safe, folded with the same care he had shown the first time. The ring followed. Then he reached for something else behind the ledger books, a small oiled parcel containing a navy wool coat with a velvet lining, a coat he had bought the week before his planned wedding. Attached to the collar was a stitched phrase, "For the keeper of fire." He stared at it for a long moment, then took the coat upstairs, shrugged on his old overcoat, and stepped out into the wind toward the weathered barn where Miriam slept, leaving the ghosts of his past locked in the dark. The days passed, and the snow kept falling, piling high against the fences, but the cold began to lose its bite under the weight of Silas's new resolve. One morning, Silas stood looking at the old horse barn, the wood sagging under its own weight and the roof leaking grey light onto the straw below. He studied the rotted beams, the broken shingles, and the patchwork tarp fluttering in the wind that served as Miriam's only door. He turned abruptly and rode into town. By noon, an old carpenter named Clyde, who had once built the massive Morgan stables, was standing beside him in the snow. "New barn?" Clyde asked, kicking a rusted hinge. "No," Silas said, his voice flat. "Rebuild this one. Make it tight. Make it warm." Clyde squinted at him, confused. "For livestock?" Silas hesitated, his eyes flicking to where Eli was peeking out from the burlap. "For people," he said quietly. Clyde looked at him, eyebrows raised high, but he saw the set of Silas's jaw and simply nodded. Understood. For the next week, Silas supervised every board placed, every nail driven into wood. He said little, as always, but when a ranch hand asked what the place was for, he simply replied, "Someone cold and nothing more." Inside the renovated structure, the wind no longer howled. It only whispered against sturdy pine walls. Miriam said nothing when she saw the work begin, but she touched the fresh wood like it was made of glass, her eyes filled with a quiet, terrified gratitude. By the end of the week, however, the town was talking. Whispers slithered from the mercantile to the pews of the old chapel, words sharpening like knives in mouths too bored or bitter to stay silent. "She moved in on him," a woman hissed by the dry goods counter. "That widow with those kids. They say he gave her a whole barn, wood and all. Men like Silas do not give anything unless they're getting something." The gossip turned physical one evening when a rock struck the side of the makeshift shelter behind the Morgan ranch just before the renovations were complete. Miriam flinched, her body instinctively tensing over Annie, who had just begun to doze. A voice rang out from the dark, cruel and sneering. "Tricks do not buy bread here, girl. Earn your way like the rest of us." She said nothing. She never did. She only held her children closer and waited for silence, knowing that poverty was a sin that the wealthy rarely forgave. The next morning, Silas rode to the edge of town to check on a grain delivery. Carl, one of his older managers, ambitious, loud and concerned with status, rode beside him. Carl cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the cold air. "Sir, we need to talk," he began. Silas kept his eyes on the hills. Carl continued, emboldened by the silence. "There's talk about the widow. It's turning bad. Men at the saloon say she's ruining the Morgan name." Silas did not respond. Carl tried again, more forcefully. "With respect, sir, ranchers fall not from drought or wolves, but from scandal. You let this go on, and you'll be known as the man who traded his good name for charity." Silas reined in his horse, the leather creaking. He turned to Carl slowly. "Do you know what is worth more than land?" he asked, his voice calm but hard as granite. Carl hesitated. "Sir?" Silas's jaw tightened. A kind word, when someone has nothing left. Carl fell silent, unable to meet his employer's gaze. That Sunday morning, the church bell rang clear over the frozen fields, summoning the town to judgment. As usual, the townspeople filled the narrow wooden pews, dusting snow from their coats, nodding politely but watching everything with hawk-like eyes. The door creaked open midway through the opening hymn, and the singing faltered. Silas Morgan entered, tall and unmistakable in his black wool coat, and behind him walked 4 children. Eli held Silas's hand, his small fingers disappearing into the large gloved palm, while the other children clutched their coats nervously. Behind them, Miriam paused in the doorway, unsure, looking ready to bolt back into the cold. Eyes turned, mouths fell silent. But Silas stepped back, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and leaned in, his voice low enough only for her. "If you walk away now, they will think no one is worth protecting." Miriam blinked hard, fighting back tears, then nodded once. Together, they walked down the center aisle. No one moved, no one breathed. They took a pew near the front. After the sermon, as the congregation began to stir, Silas stood before the pulpit. The preacher, old Reverend Hale, looked up in surprise as Silas removed his hat and addressed the room. "I am here to make one thing clear," his voice echoed off the rafters. "These children and their mother live under my protection, my land, my roof, not as charity, but because I choose to stand where I believe it is right to stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas met every gaze with a challenge. "If any man here thinks less of me for that, he is welcome to walk his boots across my fields and tell me to my face." Silence reigned. Then slowly, Reverend Hale stepped forward, placed a hand on Silas's arm, and said simply, "Amen." That was all. But when Miriam stepped out into the cold after the service, no rocks followed her, no names, no threats, only space. Quiet, respectful space. From that day on, no one dared call her a guest. They knew she was under the shield of the Morgan name. The fire started just after midnight, born from a stray spark and fed by a wind that was cruel and hungry, craving chaos in the dark. It began with a hiss, then a crack, and finally the sharp, unmistakable roar of flames devouring dry pine. Miriam woke to the sound of June screaming, "Mommy, it is hot! Mommy!" The children scrambled in the pitch black, coughing as the air turned thick and grey. The door of the newly renovated barn glowed an angry orange, its frame licked by fire that danced with terrifying speed. Miriam grabbed Annie, her heart thundering against her ribs, and reached for the latch, but the metal seared her palm. She yelped, snatching her hand back, and shouted over the roar, "Stay close to me, get low!" Tommy coughed violently, and Eli tried to pull June beneath the wool blankets, but the smoke was relentless. It was Miriam's silence, her helpless, gasping realization that they were trapped, that tore the night apart. Then came a sound heavier than the fire, boots pounding against the frozen earth, a crash, and the splintering of wood. Through the heat-blurred haze, the door burst inward. A figure wrapped in a soaked horse blanket slammed against the burning timber once, twice, until it gave way. It was Silas. He moved like a shadow through the flame, scooping up Annie and Tommy first, thrusting them into the cold air outside where a terrified ranch hand had just arrived. Blinking against the smoke, Silas turned back. The second time, he staggered. A burning beam fell from the loft, smashing across his shoulder with a sickening thud. He barely grunted, lifting the weight off with a surge of adrenaline, and found Eli and Miriam curled near the hearth. "I've got you," Silas rasped. He pushed them out ahead of him, his own coat smoking, shielding them with his body until they collapsed onto the snow. "You're bleeding," Miriam sobbed, clutching his arm. "You're back." Silas pressed a hand into his coat, where warmth spread like spilled ink. "If I die," he whispered, his breath shallow and ragged, "teach them. Men must keep their word." The wind howled against the wooden frame of the main ranch house that night, louder than it had in weeks, dragging dry leaves across the porch like old regrets refusing to settle. Inside the master bedroom, the fire burned low, casting long shadows against the walls. Miriam sat on the edge of Silas's bed, her knees pressed close together, her back straight, despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Her hands were careful and steady as she peeled back the old bandage from his shoulder. The linen, bloodied and sticking to the skin, came away slowly, revealing angry bruises and a jagged cut that required stitching. Silas did not flinch, though his jaw clenched tight, a muscle ticking rhythmically near his temple. "I will be gentle," she said, her voice quiet but sure, the tone of a woman who knows that panic serves no purpose in the face of pain. Silas said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, unmoving, not really looking at the wooden beams but staring into a distance she could not see. Somewhere far beyond the roof, beyond the sky, his mind wandered where his body could not follow. Miriam pressed a warm cloth to the wound, cleaning away the dried blood. The silence in the room was heavy, not with tension but with the weight of things unsaid. Then, a long moment later, his voice emerged, rough, dry, as if it had scraped its way out of a locked room inside his chest. "I bought a ring once." Miriam froze. Her hands paused against his skin, her breath catching just slightly, but she did not look up. She waited. "7 years ago," he continued, exhaling slowly as if the words were heavier than the air itself. "For Esther." The name hung in the room like smoke. I thought she looked at me like I was more than a ranch, more than land and fences and cattle counts. I was going to give her everything, house, title, my name on hers. I told myself I was finally needed. Miriam still said nothing. Her silence was a gift, a space for him to bleed out the poison of the past. "She left," Silas said, his voice cracking barely. "Took what I had tucked away for the new land contract. Left a note in the safe. Said she never loved me. Said she just wanted to escape being poor." He closed his eyes. "I did not love her for long after that, but I hated myself for much longer. I wanted to be the savior. I wanted to be necessary." Miriam dipped clean linen into warm water, wrung it out, and began rewrapping the wound. Her movements were gentle but firm, the way a woman learns to be when everything soft inside her has once been used against her. "You do not need to be needed, Silas," she said quietly. He blinked, turning his head slightly as if her words had drawn him back from a cliff's edge. "You only need to be seen," she continued, meeting his gaze. "And you are. Every time I look at you, I see the strongest man I have ever known." The fire popped in the hearth, sparks rising and falling like silent punctuation. He did not respond at first, but his breathing changed, slower, calmer, as if something deep inside his chest had finally stopped bracing for a blow. Outside, the wind paused briefly, as if the world itself was listening to the shift in the room. Then, without looking at her, Silas turned his hand palm up on the quilt. It was a small gesture, but for a man who had built walls of ice around his life, it was a surrender. Miriam looked down. Her hand hovered in the air for a heartbeat, and then she placed hers in his. His fingers were cold and rough, trembling not from the pain of the burn, but from something far older and harder to heal. They sat like that for a long time, no more words, just skin to skin, breath to breath, proof that neither was entirely alone in the dark. Then, in the hush between wind gusts, Silas whispered, his voice thin but ringing with a new truth. "If you are still here come morning, then this is not a ranch anymore." He looked at her fully now, his grey eyes dark and bare, stripped of their winter armor. "It is a home." Spring rolled in like a soft, overdue sigh across the valley, breaking the stranglehold of the long winter. The last stubborn patches of frost melted into rushing streams, the brown grass turned a vibrant, living green on the hills, and birds began nesting noisily under the eaves of the barns. Silas Morgan had never noticed how the air smelled different when the snow was finally gone. Lighter, sweeter, almost forgiving. By the lake behind the main ranch, where the water caught the dying light just right at dusk, turning it to liquid gold, he began to build again. This time, it was a small house with pine walls, a sturdy stone chimney, and a wide porch facing the water. It was not grand, not meant to impress bankers or cattle barons, but it was warm, the kind of place that smelled like firewood and fresh bread before a fire was ever lit. He never explicitly said it was for them, but as the structure took shape, Miriam and the children simply moved in. No one asked for permission. No paper was signed, no agreement made, no rent discussed. It was simply understood, the kind of deep, silent understanding that grows only from smoke, survival, and the shared memory of the cold. They cooked over the new hearth, filling the space with the sense of life. Eli helped sweep the porch, dragging a broom twice his size. June picked wildflowers, sticking them in every jar she could find until the windowsills rippled with color. Tommy named the chickens, and Annie laughed more than she cried. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and heavy in the sky, Eli ran into the barn where Silas was oiling a harness. His cheeks were pink with the sun, his hands clutching a piece of scrap wood. He held it out to Silas with both hands, his expression solemn. "I made this," he said proudly. Silas wiped his hands on a rag and took it. It was just a scrap plank, uneven and smudged with ash, but carved with painstaking care were words that were crooked but clear. "This is our forever man." For the first time in more years than he could count, Silas laughed. It wasn't a quiet, restrained chuckle, but a real, startled, belly-deep laugh that echoed off the barn walls and made Annie jump with delight from where she played in the straw. That night, when the house by the lake had gone quiet, Silas went to the old storage room in the main house. It smelled of cedar and old memories he no longer feared. He opened the trunk he had not touched since the winter Esther left and pulled out a heavy wooden sign wrapped in cloth. "Morgan Estate," it read, carved deep and dark, meant to hang over the porch of a life that never came to be. Silas flipped it over. The back was smooth, untouched wood. He took his carving knife, the same one his father had given him, and began again. Letter by letter, strip by strip. It took hours, but by dawn he held something new. "Morgan family," it read now, and underneath, in smaller letters, "Not for sale." He carried the sign down to the house by the lake just as the morning mist was lifting. Miriam was already at the stove stirring oats, the rhythmic clink of the spoon a sound Silas found he looked forward to. The children were chasing each other on the grass, their shouts ringing clear in the crisp air. Silas said nothing to interrupt them. He simply hung the sign by the door, right above the frame, not high, not hidden, but just enough for every visitor, every doubt and every ghost of the past to see. That evening, as the sun poured amber light through the windows, turning the dust motes into dancing gold, Miriam stood at the threshold. She held Annie on her hip while Eli clutched a worn book, and Tommy and June whispered about supper. Silas stood inside, near the hearth. He did not open the door for them. He had already opened it hours ago and left it that way, unlatched and waiting. "Are we early?" Miriam teased softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Silas shook his head, looking at the chaotic, beautiful mess of life standing in his doorway. "No," he said, his voice steady and full. "Just in time." She stepped in first. The children followed, trailing shadows and laughter into the room. And Silas spoke the words for the first time in his life, not to land, not to contracts or cattle or banks, but to people, to the ones he had chosen. "Welcome home."